passionate about what you do. And it comes
Yeah.
across. Like, I don't get to talk to you all the time. I gratefully like met you one time in person, although we've known each other for a few years now. Back when
Wow.
the real
Yes.
world was filmed, it's been like maybe 4 years, which is wild. But it's so clear how much you love what you do just from following you on social, on LinkedIn, and you have such a great smile. Like I can feel your energy when you're posting. So I would
Oh,
love
thank
for you
you.
to just introduce yourself so people can learn about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, sure. My name is Henry Gordon Smith. I'm passionate about the future of agriculture and adapting to climate change. The way I focus on that is through a few different activities. The first is as a college student, I got passionate about urban agriculture, growing food in the city and integrating into buildings. And I started a blog in 2011 called Agritecture. And I wanted to feature things that I couldn't find online. I wanted to understand what are the different technologies, what are the different methods, what's the business case, what's the architecture approach, and, bring those all together in one place. What was really exciting is that as I put that passion out there and as I created that content, thousands, tens of thousands of people around the world found my site. And it was just an original like Tumblr blog back in the day. And they really enjoyed it. And I got all this positive feedback about that they were looking for this and that they needed it. And that really fueled me to continue to create more content. And some of those things involved visiting vertical farms and featuring them and talking about the pros and cons of their approach. And for example, I visited Local Garden, which was the United States or North America's first commercial vertical farm that was advertised. And this was a pretty cool vertical farm. It was very novel on the rooftop of a garage, but it had a lot of problems. It was kind of over engineered. It was growing the wrong crop for the market. And I wrote about that and I sort of started forming this analytical lens about what works and what doesn't. One year, that company went out of business and they sold their equipment desperately on Craigslist. And so there was this real interest in vertical farming, for example, as one method of new agriculture that you could integrate into buildings anywhere. Vertical farming involves growing food indoors with typically artificial light and hydroponic systems. You can put them in warehouses or basements, or you can do small versions or big versions. You can automate them. So it was really kind of a sexy technology that was getting a lot of interest around the 2010s, 2011s. And that interest really accelerated up until 2021, I would say, and is still of interest. And it's grown a lot. We can talk about that. But sort of long story short, there were problems with the way people were doing it. And I became very analytical in that. And then in 2014, people started asking me for consulting. And I never imagined that my blog would turn into a consultancy. But people were saying, no one knows the yields. If I go to the technology companies, they're trying to sell me equipment. I need someone to sort of be creative and design this and fit this into my space. And I sort of, this light bulb went off that I was like, yeah, there's no one doing like tech agnostic consulting, right? In agriculture, typically the consultants are just pushing equipment on you. Use this, use that. And so they provide services that are good. But in a world like today, I think you need a more independent advisor that's going to care about your needs above all and not getting a commission from selling equipment.
Right.
And so that's when agriculture consulting was born. And I started hiring basically a dream team for this kind of service. I hired engineers, I hired agronomists, I hired marketing professionals and people who good at finance. And we built the world's first global urban agriculture consultancy. And so that's what we were focused on, was bringing farming into cities and answering questions. And vertical farming was a big piece of that. So we provided feasibility studies, market research studies. But over time, since 2014, we've diversified a lot. We started getting requests from cities that wanted to design food systems, wanted to incentivize these kinds of new technologies, wanted to improve equity related to food access. And so we started providing a lot of services to governments, including the city of Paris, Dallas, Atlanta, Auckland, New Zealand, Doha, Qatar, to name a few. And we also started getting interest from investors, especially as billions of dollars started flowing into vertical farming, big vertical farms like Aero Farms and Plenty and Bowery. Investors wanted to hire us, and they did hire us to do due diligence on those farms to say, are their yields accurate? Because the investors didn't understand, the technology value or the systems.
Right.
And that lack of understanding of agriculture, which is very complicated. I mean, yields vary, technologies vary. The numbers can be very complicated. Economic models for farms are different across scales. There's a lot of considerations. So our specialization in that became really valuable. So anyway, we have a range of clients. We've worked on 250 different consultations in over 45 countries. So we've been quite global since the beginning. We're based in New York, but we work all around the world. And just one last point, in 2020, when COVID hit, our consulting services suffered. And we started to talk internally about what we could do to still have an impact, but sort of live in a more digital world. So we actually moved our company to be fully digital. And then we built the world's first farm planning software. So we decided, okay, let's try and let's take all the knowledge we have and let's put it into a software program. So let's say you're a developer, you can actually input the location, you can input the size of your farm, you can choose from 100 different crops, and within minutes, you can get an economic model for a vertical farm or a greenhouse. And so it could be a rooftop greenhouse, it could be a vertical farm in a building, and it's called Agriculture Designer, and that's the third part of our business. Wow. We still run all three parts of these businesses, and it's been a really exciting sort of 10-year journey. I mean, since 2014, I've been doing the consulting, and since 2011, I've been running the blog, and it really is a passion. I mean, I feel lucky every day to be able to travel the world and to visit farms and to create new farms and to work with an incredible team. That's the best part.
It is so cool. For anybody who doesn't follow you, you guys need to start following Henry ASAP. He's always somewhere exotic. I mean, how much fun to be in some of these farms and see probably produce that we, in the US, you're never going to lay eyes on, let alone get a chance to eat or see how it grows.
I mean, I was just like, I get surprised all the time, I mean, I was in the UAE and I saw this one sort of plantation, this sort of crazy guy, farmer guy, and he just captures plants from all around the world and just tries to grow them. So he's trying to grow coffee in the UAE, he's growing papayas, mangoes, and he's got a dragon fruit trial. And dragon fruit is sort of an emerging popular product because it's got some nutrition benefits. I personally am not a huge fan of the taste, but some people like it. And it can cost a lot to import. Yeah. So it's really cool to see farmers experimenting with that. And I have to say the farm tours, which I feature on my Instagram, are my favorite part. I've got 70 of them now on my Instagram, and they're all around the world. And I love it when farms open up and I can share knowledge with them and they share with me.
So cool. It's so amazing to think that you started this as a blog just because you're like, nobody's talking about this. And now look what you get to do. It really is unbelievable. So a few years ago when we were filming our Built World docu-series, we had you in our food episode really with Farm One, and we were talking about, it was an urban farm in Tribeca, used to be an old spin studio, brought to life. And that was incredible to see in person. But we did an interview with you. I believe it was remote. You were in Prague, I want to say. Yeah. My videographer was there, which happened to be, and that was so cool. And you have given such an incredible context for how we kind of got here in terms of how removed a lot of primarily cities, people living in urban environments, but even in the suburbs, in a lot of cases, we're so removed from the farming itself and where our food is coming from. And I learned that you might be sitting in New York City eating a salad that had to travel 3,000 miles to be sitting in front of you. I mean, when you really think about not just the real estate that it takes to grow and how that's designed, but also the logistics and the impact to our environment and our planet for having to transport food from such a distance. I would love for you to give just like a couple minutes of that kind of historical evolution to this moment, and maybe how people like you are helping restore some of that connection.
Yeah, absolutely. It was so fun to be on the Built World and to be in that episode and share what Farm One, our client, was doing. They're so amazing and really proud of what they've done. So to answer your question, I think, first of all, I'm a city slicker. I was born in Hong Kong and I grew up in Tokyo till 10. So I did not grow up on farms or anything. Sure. I always had an appreciation for greenery and things like that. And my parents did too. They love nature, but I was not at all engaged in it. So there was a many years, many experiences that led me to find this opportunity that I wanted to film. Now, look, I think agriculture is, as I said, it's so complicated, both from the economic side and the planning side. But it's also got this really complicated history, and it sort of ebbs and flows as far as how we value it and how we need it. And let me give some examples of that. There was a time in the 70s and 80s where, malnutrition around the world was really a critical issue for a lot of development agencies. And there was also simultaneously a lot of technology evolving around fertilizers and chemical inputs that were increasing yields. And so this sort of green revolution happened where agriculture became much more productive. And we started actually producing more food than we ever had on Earth. And we started being able to produce that food in places that weren't actually for agriculture originally. We didn't depend as much on water or the environment. We started building infrastructure. We started growing in areas that weren't naturally attuned to growing certain crops. And this was happening, across the world. And what happened is we started removing agriculture, which was typically closer to where we lived. Historically, we'd always have farms where we lived because we needed sustenance. We would grow some of our own things and trade it with others. Right. That's a simplification, but that's really how it was, especially on the edges of cities. And I think that the Green Revolution sort of allowed us to sort of import our food from whenever we wanted and created some more sort of commoditization of certain crops. That they're just products on the market that you can buy, the prices change or whatever. And the supply chain actually became very sophisticated. And although there's many problems with it, as you mentioned, with the carbon footprint of the food miles and the food waste and the quality loss, it's quite efficient to some extent and very advanced. And it's, again, feeding billions of people around the world and allowing places that didn't have certain products suddenly have their markets filled with products from around the world, just part of the globalization trend as well. Now, there were always concerns as we sort of moved to the end of the century about climate change that started arising and lack of water. We use 70% of our fresh water for agriculture. Most of our arable land is used already up for agriculture. We have a lot of pesticide use that's damaged ecosystems. So these concerns started becoming more relevant and being talked about. And I think that more and more farmers started to say, okay, I want to save fertilizer, I want to save water, etc. And the sort of Dutch example of how they were able to produce so much in a small piece of land, again, the Netherlands is the size of Maryland, and it's the second largest agricultural exporter in the world. So it became this example to all kinds of places around the world that wanted to grow with less water to build hydroponic farms and greenhouses. And these greenhouses, they can be in many different kinds of places. Sometimes they're in Spain where they're actually exporting most of it, but sometimes they started to be more local. Now, the local movement also started to rise around this time where people said, okay, organic is good, but actually local really matters to me because I feel like I want to support local farmers. I want the freshness. The sort of farm to table movement was being pushed by, chefs like Dan Barber and others that really made it popularized. And so that became a business opportunity in addition to the climate change drivers, where you could actually grow local food and target more premium customers in urban areas that valued that. And so urban agriculture has been around for a while, but sort of there became this alignment in the late, let's say in 2009, 2010, where hydroponics and local food and this sort of urban trend for local food and climate change started to collide. And that's sort of the time that my blog started. And I was able to feature these projects that were emerging and these entrepreneurs that were doing this and the technologies that were backing them. And, I think it's really important we grow food in cities. And there's a couple main reasons why I think it's important. And the main reason I think is, again, like you mentioned, we need to understand where our food comes from in order to value it. You can't appreciate something you don't see or understand. You just treat it like a product. We all know we do it. We go to the restaurant or we go to the supermarket. We don't even think about it. We just order what we want when we want it. And that's something we become attuned to because of that globalization of the food system. But I think appreciating it helps us really get to the first step of creating a more values-driven food system. Another reason to bring it closer is, again, we reduce the carbon footprint of the food miles, and more importantly, the waste that occurs. Although we produce so much more food, we produce more food than we need on Earth. Much of it, 30, 40% approximately, depending on the farm type and the product, gets wasted, which is a disaster. Yeah. It's just terrible. We also get lower quality. So there's an important reason to localize food for that as well. I think the third reason that matters to me is resilience. Resilience. If we look back at history, World War I, World War II, the U.S. blockade of Russian imports in agriculture to Cuba, and the COVID pandemic, we can see clear examples of urban agriculture specifically, not even just local agriculture, urban agriculture specifically, making us more resilient to these supply chain threats that occurred. Not even threats, crises that occurred.
Sure.
So the victory gardens are probably the example that most people know about. Citizens were activated to grow food at schools, at churches, at home. Then the other farms outside of the city didn't grow short-term crops like leafy greens or even vine crops like tomatoes. They let the urban farms grow those, and they focused on staple crops. So it was a collaboration between urban farms and rural farms. And actually, 40% of the fresh vegetables were grown in the US during World War II because of these victory gardens, because we activated a society to adapt. And I think that that is enough evidence for every city to say we need a percentage of our city that actually grows its own food. And we need a percentage of people that grow their own food, because that's going to make us resilient to the inevitable shocks of these ebbs and flows in the food system because of crises or whatever. Again, COVID, same thing. If you look at Chiang Mai or big touristy areas, when tourism stopped, people who really needed income lost their income, and that income was going towards food. So they started building community farms. There's one example in Chiang Mai, the community coming together and growing their own food and sharing that. There's also the Russian blockade, which occurred when Cuba was blocked from the US, no imports of fertilizer, seeds, anything like that. And Cuba became food secure and food independent through urban agriculture. They initiated 8,000 organic urban farms across Havana and the nearby area, which helped make the country more resilient. There's a lot of these case studies, really
And
a
then
lot
the
of them.
skills that need to be in place that those people
That's
must
the point.
need.
The
Right.
skills are needed. I think to my parents, right? My mom is an amazing flower gardener and gardener in general. My dad, rest in peace, was an incredible gardener. But if we look at our generation, we just know how to use our phones. Like we don't really know how to grow. We haven't been taught, we haven't been
Hey
exposed to it.
Siri.
Hey Siri, but you really need to, agriculture is long and patient. You need patience. It's difficult. You need to understand seed. You need to understand transplanting times, growth times, harvest times, soil quality management,
Sure.
technology in some cases. So my concern is we are not prepared for the
No.
inevitable shocks of the future. And that's the third reason why I think urban agriculture specifically is so necessary. And this is a real crisis on the horizon. If we look at Sydney, just to give you one example, I mentioned how cities used to grow their own food. There's an analysis from Sydney Futures that 30% of the food in Sydney around the 2000s was coming from within 100 kilometers of Sydney. Sydney has expanded so much as a city. It's really grown. And all these different municipalities around Sydney are not collaborating to protect the food. So they're turning these farms into concrete. They're turning them into suburbs. And they're not making any requirements to maintain any agriculture. So that production has gone down to 6%. 6% in 20 years. Well, Sydney, what is it going to do now? It's just importing the food. Even though it has a good climate, it had good soil. This is one of dozens, hundreds of cities that are pursuing the same strategy, not to protect their local food system and to pave over these arable land areas, push farmers out because they want to sell their land, they're giving up.
Right.
And this is just a perfect example of how we don't value food enough to look towards the future. And it's part of our human nature. We don't really act until a real crisis happens.
Well, I think we're also in a lot of cases, especially in these urban environments, you overvalue the real estate and we tend to overbuild. That's just the industry that we're in. And it's something that, there really aren't too many of these conversations happening in commercial real estate, and we need to have them because I don't think a lot of people have that even ingredient in their recipe for real estate success. It's not even an ingredient, right? It's not even in there. It's not factoring in. It's not even a concept. Like you might be looking at soil as it relates to developing a building and how conducive it is for that, but you're not thinking about, how could I preserve what's already here? How could I adjust it or transfer this value in some way? And this is, one of the questions I was really dying to ask you about. And again, there are a lot of intricacies, of course, and I don't have the technical understanding, of course, that you do. I'm sure a few people do. However, it would occur to me and probably many people in the industry that we have more and more empty buildings, more and more buildings around the world that are becoming obsolete, if not already obsolete, let's be honest, whether they're an old strip mall, malls in general. You have office buildings emptier than ever. I mean, a lot of headlines will say that we're almost back to COVID, pre-COVID occupancy. Even at pre-COVID occupancy, there was about 40% of office buildings that were going underutilized. So I don't think that's any major success. I think it's highlighting a big glaring issue that we had that a lot of people want to put a Band-Aid on and not admit was there. But in order to stop putting a Band-Aid on things and really build for the future and the health of these communities and the buildings that are in them, we have to be innovative. So is there a reason, is there a barrier to entry why some of these office buildings wouldn't be converted into urban farms? And I'm prefacing this with, there's a lot of conversation around converting office building to multifamily. And there are a lot of reasons. There are a lot of ways that the office building might be built that is not conducive to building an apartment. But what is the barrier to entry? Is there one? Is it just not part of the conversation yet? Is it something we're probably going to see?
Yeah, I think there's great opportunities for vacant spaces in cities around the world. In fact, there was an analysis done of just vacant space, and it was estimated that 10% of our global fresh fruits and vegetables could be grown in vacant spaces in cities alone. So that again is a really good start. Again, we're talking about getting this part of the culture of the city and showing people this, which is going to improve how it performs and make it better. But this was an analysis where they looked at Google Earth Engine and looked at all the available space and did that. That's not even looking at warehouses or basements or things like that. That's rooftops and that's vacant spaces in cities around the world. And that doesn't, if you actually looked at the cities outside of the city, just on the edge, what we call peri-urban agriculture, you would get to 40, 50% in many cases.
Unbelievable.
Now, there's a couple things to consider. One is the climate, right? So there's a whole series of integrations that you can have into buildings with agriculture. Some of them could be a rooftop soil-based farm. Some of them could be a low-tech hydroponic farm on a vertical plane, like a wall. Some of them could be a vertical farm indoors, like farm one we talked about in a basement, a rooftop greenhouse, an on-the-ground greenhouse. So some of them just require a certain amount of physical space and sunlight and a climate, right? So if you're in a place that has difficult winters, growing a rooftop farm with soil has pros and cons because you're not going to grow as much in the winter, although Brooklyn Grange in New York is doing a great job at that, and they have a viable business despite not growing in the winter. But there's Sky Vegetables in New York, which is a rooftop greenhouse, which grows year-round hydroponically. So there are options for that. If you look at Sky Vegetables, for example, it's about 12,000 square feet rooftop. So it's not bad, but really, when you look at greenhouses, you kind of need an acre minimum. And even for rooftop farms in general, most farmers will want an acre minimum. And that limits the number of rooftops that make sense for this. Now, you could have residential rooftops that could do this. In that case, it wouldn't be a business. It would be more of a community farm.
A community farm.
And an amenity. And I think that that's really undervalued and underutilized in cities in general. Because I think a lot of people...
Yeah. Can you imagine if you're picking between this luxury building or this luxury building, and how many of them are there in New York City? And one has a community indoor farm?
Yes.
Are you kidding me?
And you know what? There's a city that did a really good job at this and can be a good case study for what's possible. And Paris, which again, I had the honor of being a judge for the competition and advising on the initial developments of it, but it was called the Paris Culture Urban Agriculture Competition. And they basically said to developers, give us your space. We're going to promote it. We'll take the business plan applications. We just want you to give them 1 to 2 years of free lease on the space. And then we will approve the one that's right and will help facilitate the integration. And they set a goal of 30 hectares of urban farming space, I think by 2030. And last time I checked, they've achieved 16 hectares of new urban farming space in Paris. And, when New York tells me, oh, our zoning is complicated, or, we can't integrate it, or da-da-da-da, I say, Paris is a historical city, much more historical than New York City. Paris citizens are pretty demanding about what they expect from aesthetics or from experience, etc. If Paris can do it, trust me, New York can do it too. And I think that's an amazing program. You can look on the site, you can see the map of the farms, you can see the movement happening. And I think it's really about leadership. I think that there's plenty of examples of leadership doing that and creating incentives, even small incentives to connect the entrepreneurs and the real estate developers. And I have to say, I've been very frustrated that most leadership hasn't taken the proven roadmap that is already out there, including articles that we've written about the policies that would be necessary, including urban farmers in New York City or other places that have said this is what we want. There's real ways to get there. There's real ways to do this. And there's real demonstrable data about how it can be a positive impact on the city and the community. So I think it will happen some more, but I think things unfortunately need to get worse for cities to value this. For Paris, it was the heat waves and the death of Parisian citizens that catalyzed their interest in rooftop green roofs and rooftop farms. Now, New York has incentives for green infrastructure, which has also incentivized developers to build some green roofs and in some cases urban farms. So there are clear mechanisms, but there almost needs to be a sort of crisis that leadership steps in and says, we want to do this, because developers themselves, they're business people. Agriculture will never compete against commercial residential real estate on a per square foot dollar cost.
Right.
So they have to see other value. Now, one moment about that, there is business value to integrating agriculture into your site. Agri-burbs are getting quite popular in suburban areas where they actually have space and they build a farm. And the community that lives in this space can pay an additional maintenance fee to get access to the farm and to get a CSA box. The farmer has an income. There's an amenity that the real estate developer can promote and market to stand out against the competition. There's real ways to do this. And there's examples of this in many cities across the world, as well as I mentioned, suburban areas. So I think that, people want it. There's a way to make some money off of it. And I think another benefit is if we look at the death of real estate or the suffering of retail in particular, a farm can really create interesting foot traffic. It could make your place a destination. Farms can be experiences. And so I think, whether it's an empty Target warehouse or whether it's a small empty store in a sort of strip mall, there are really fascinating ways to give farmers deals to fill in those spaces. Because this moment right now, there is so much interest from young people, from entrepreneurs, and even still investors to do this ESG kind of work, to do urban farming, to do something that's more sustainable. So developers, I think, can connect that. And that's one reason we built this software product, is that they don't have to hire a consultant to estimate the return on investment or how much they could charge the farmer rent, even though it's discounted. They can actually use our software to estimate that at a very low cost.
That's incredible. That is, I think, one major barrier to entry is that it's a totally kind of unknown tenant, right? It's a whole industry that's kind of unbeknownst to the owners, the managers, the developers. But I also think that it comes down to this like values versus like business and like ROI, kind of weighing it all the time. And it keeps coming up in this show a lot, because what is the driver? And we talk about this a lot generally, like over the years with just tech and implementing new tech and innovation. It's like, what is the driver for that? And especially when you're talking about cities like New York City, it's always going to be that business value. Like, what is the ROI? What is my return? Is this a good business choice? And I think that this is something that's going to be a better and better business decision as these next generations start to really push their priorities, and that the people who are building real estate can really understand the makeup of who that resident or tenant is and what they value. So that's when you can really start to see movement in the industry, is when the population, the consumer of the real estate, is starting to value, their position, their values as part of the makeup of what their experience should be. And so I know, certainly it's important to me. That would be like a major decision maker for me if I was in charge of leasing an office for my company or a home, in a multifamily building. If there was access to a farm, that would be a major game changer. And so I think
Yeah.
more and more people are starting to feel that way. They're starting to feel the frustration, especially in a city like New York City, where you might have one grocery store that's close enough to you to walk to be able to carry all the groceries home, and that's where you go. There's no other really experience. But we know that people will travel for a farmer's market. They will go out of their way to
Yes, we know
get
that.
their hands on.
They'll pay more.
Yeah, they'll pay more. They'll go out of their way. I mean, I've driven I'm in South Florida. I'm in Fort Lauderdale right now, but I've driven all over South Florida for a farmer's market, just not to shop at the grocery store for my produce, which is not always going to be the best. So I think it's a major game changer. And I also think that developers have to start getting creative with the real estate that we have, as much as people want to think that we'll go back to pre-pandemic occupancy. That is pie in the sky. And even if we really accomplish that goal, we're still underutilizing space at such a dramatic rate that these next generations who really prioritize also taking care of the planet, starting to understand the impact of this industry and how little we really do with these buildings that are putting out so much carbon, so much impact. I don't think that it's a sustainable mechanism to just keep putting that Band-Aid on. So I am excited to be bringing this conversation to the industry and really hoping to open people's eyes to what's possible and how creative they really could get. For you, this is every day. You're like, I do this every single day. But for this industry, I do think it takes a really unique and innovative leader, developer, owner, operator to even suggest something like this, to get into the details of, okay, how could we actually do it and what would the ROI be? But I can imagine some of these most luxurious buildings, especially even I think about South Florida, you have a Porsche building, I don't know, Dolce and Gabbana building, I mean, Mercedes-Benz building, I mean, I mean, they all have buildings. And that's, of course, like a type of luxury. But I think especially in South Florida, where people are moving here from all over the world in troves, and they will continue to, the wellness industry and community here is not as mature as I've seen it, of course, like in places like New York or California, or places where they value these things, whatever that looks like in those cities. It's not totally here yet. And so I would love to see some of these like ultra luxury developments. The makeup of what that means not having a salad that had to travel 3,000 miles, but rather was grown in your building, sitting on your plate in the Michelin star restaurant that they naturally have, right there servicing you. I mean, what is better than that? And then, you talk a lot about just these potential crises that could come up, and how much are we relying on outsourcing our food? I mean, such a crucial part of our survival as human beings. New York City, like, how long are we surviving without trucks?
It really freaks me out. I mean, like, I move forward with positivity, but it really freaks me out, because, Hurricane Sandy, which I was there for, it knocked out Lower Manhattan. But just imagine if it had been a little bit off that course, and if it had hit Hunts Point, which is the world's largest food distribution hub, Hunts Point would have been out of operation. And we talked about food being pushed away from the city to different places around the world that we import, but there's also been a trend of consolidation, right? So monocultures, like all kinds of farms of the same type, but also markets. New York City used to have, I think, 20 or 30 different food markets, distribution centers, one for fish, one for vegetables. And these were they ran a bit differently as far as how they worked, and they actually supported more local food systems in different ways. But there is efficiency created that we know about real estate by scale. And so Hunts Point was chosen as the centralized location, and it's in a floodplain. If Hunts Point goes out of operation, I saw a study that we have 3 days of food in New York City. So if you imagine if there's a real storm, which we have climate change predictions about floods and storms, we know storms are going to get worse. We've already experienced that. What do we think is going to happen? They're trying to make Hunts Point more resilient, which is great. That's one way to do it. But I think there's other ways to do that as well. Now, farms can get damaged from storms too, but some farms are indoors, So I think it's again about the culture. Like, how many people in the city or even in our country do we need to understand how to grow food? because we need some chance to adapt. If nobody knows how to do that, you can import the food when it's available, but you can't
Right.
import the talent when
Right.
it's that quickly. You can't just create that industry overnight. The Netherlands took 40, 50 years to become where they are. So, that's what they've done is they've said this is a job that you can make money off of. This is a business that we're going to incentivize. They promised after World War II, when they had a huge starvation issue in World War II, they promised we will never go hungry again. And look at them now. And I think that's the kind of commitment that needs to be made. And even apart from these shocks in the systems, in New York City, we have 1 in 4 children that are going hungry in New York City, one of the richest places in the world.
Yeah.
You leave Manhattan, you go to the Bronx, you can see it for yourself. And the Bronx has a lot of available spaces. So my advice to the city of New York was to say, hey, do the Paris Couture competition from Paris, but just do it in the Bronx and see what happens.
That would be
Just do it there. To focus on the area and that need to provide food access, food equity,
At New
and
York
and
City, you have a lot of basement space. Like I know there's a
yeah,
lot of really heavy fire codes for the roofs and things like that, right? Totally get it because I talked about solar also in the built
yeah,
world quite a bit.
yeah,
But
there
you
are
have a lot of
challenges, but
basement
we need to
space.
experiment.
Right, right. But New York, I mean, New York City is infamous for having a lot of underutilized basement space. And I know there are some cool companies that are coming in and having, potentially like opportunities for revenue in those spaces, whether it's storage or whatever. Hey, you don't have
Let's
to,
grow some food. Yeah, let's grow
right.
some
Yeah, let's
food.
grow
Let's
some
grow some
food. Let's
farmers.
grow some
Yeah,
food. This
let's.
is just wasted space. I mean, so much wasted space that could be activated. And here, I mean, again, I'm in South Florida today. I mean, you have an abundance of rooftop sun.
Oh yeah,
I mean, you have sun all year, all year.
all year.
So, and it's not just, of course, like the talent that we talked about, but it's also the materials. Like I know I used to live in Maine, like, no, all the way north, and you had such a short growing season. And the same tomatoes that grow great up in Maine don't love it here in Florida. So how are
Right.
we overnight, aside from the skill turnover, how do you
Yeah.
all of a sudden decide to have the right materials to grow food where you are? So it's such an interesting, I mean, you must, you must have a lot of
I mean,
frustration.
look, yeah, there's again, like for me, it goes down to, as we've talked about, valuing food, valuing quality food, valuing local food, and all the things related to that, including the skills, the technology needed, the policies and incentives, the education and training. That's what we need. And again, we have examples. We know how to do this. There is a road map for how to do this, whether it's the Netherlands, whether it's as I mentioned, Paris, but many other places that have said we can do this, we want to do this. So I think that there's really ways to do this. And just people need to like sort of take the opportunity. Now, I'm not saying it's easy. There's definitely a challenging business case in agriculture because as this abundance of food has occurred globally, even though it is being threatened from a supply chain perspective now more and more, and prices are fluctuating, that has dropped the price of food for us, especially in the Western world. As a percentage of our total income, we pay much less for food than places like Thailand or India, for example, where people are paying sometimes 30, 40% of their income towards food, while we pay more towards rent and other things. So I think that, the pricing is also important. We need to value when we shop the local food. We need to actually value it in what we ask for. As you said, choose a building that has a farm or community garden or has something like this, because you're going to get what you pay for.
Right.
And I think that we've been paying for cheap food from wherever it's coming from. And that's what we've shown the market, the capitalist market, that we value. So there's a role for consumers, there's a role for policymakers, real estate developers, et cetera. There are developers that come to us at Agritecture. We work with developers, and there are challenges to integrate it into their spaces, but we always find a way to make a viable business case that actually has some sustainability benefit for that. So there's definitely ways to do it. And I think it's really exciting. I think it's really fun as well, especially for me, I've always wanted to be an architect, to really work with developers, because it's different from a farm that we design outside of the city or whatever, which is pretty standard in some ways. But in the city is where it gets interesting. That's what agritecture is about, is like, what can we do with these spaces? What can we do to think about the people that are going to interact with this space and consume this food? And that to me is those are the most exciting projects because they are the most challenging. But there are ways to do it for sure.
So cool. where can we find you? Where can people connect with you? Your research.
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find. As I said, I sort of started as a blogger, so I continue to do that. If you're interested in my like global travels and who I am on the Agritech on Instagram, you can see my farm tours. You can see a lot of the things I'm promoting, and you can see sort of where I'm going, etc. LinkedIn is where I publish my weekly newsletter, which is about the food system overall, and I'd love to connect with you there. And our website is where you can look if you want to see our services, our portfolio. It's agritecture.com, and you can always contact us if you want to work with us.
I highly recommend connecting with Henry. He's so much fun to follow on all your travels across the world and see what you're up to. It really is a lot of fun. I have one final question, which I'm asking all of my guests, which is what's one thing that you do to take care of your own health? And it's interesting because of all the amazing things we talked about, we didn't even have to specifically talk about health and the impact of, growing food, maybe in an urban environment, and how much fewer pesticides and all these. We didn't even have to talk about all of that because we didn't have to. There's so much, and it's so evident, kind of where we're starting. At least from my audience and our understanding as an industry, the lack of conversations to the potential and looking at you and like what you've been able to create in your hands in all these projects, what is really possible. So putting all of that aside on a personal basis, what is something you do to care for you?
I mean, I'm really into fitness. I have specific fitness goals, and I think that, one way to really think about food is to take care of your body and see the effects of eating different foods on your body, and then you get the rewards of that. You can see it physically, you can feel it in your energy, you can feel it in your mood. And so I think that's one piece of a range of physical and mental health activities that I focus on. But that's the one that I've been seriously committed to and I've set goals for, and really, really brings me a lot of joy, to be honest.
That's what brings all the smiles and the good vibes through all of your posts. You guys know what I mean.
I think that's my work. Like, I feel so lucky every day that I get to do. It's hard. Like, it's hard being an entrepreneur, but I wouldn't want to do anything else because, we have a company that makes money and we're making an impact. And I think that is exactly the business I wanted to make. And I feel privileged that I get to do that. And all the people, the mentors, the opportunities, the previous jobs, the followers of the blog, the clients, all the people that have led up to that, I'm so grateful for because I feel honored every day that I get to do this. I get to work on the future of food, something that's important, and something that's getting more important. In the old days, like 10 years ago, we were very, very niche and very, obscure, and people were like, okay, this is never going to work. This is crazy. Totally. And now, we're very much in demand and we're working on large projects. We're planning new cities now. We're getting cities that are being designed from the start. They're developing new cities and they're hiring food systems consultants, us, to plan not just one farm, but the system overall. I mean, what an honor to get to work on that with my amazing team. So that's where the smiles come from.
Thank God for you doing the work that you do, really. I mean, what an incredible even concept to understand in terms of, because we talk a lot about placemaking in commercial real estate and buying a building or an area of a city and making that place a destination, making the experience soup to nuts. And it makes so much sense. Like how
every place needs food. Everybody eats.
Fundamental, right?
It's like how can a city or a building really be smart without agriculture? I don't see it.
And it's interesting because obviously when you think about placemaking, I think about Hudson Yards, for example, or the Seaport, right? Obviously in New York, we talk about New York a lot, but these are places where you're naturally going to have the highest end chef, right? In that restaurant, because that's going to be a main attraction, or many super high end chefs, Michelin star chefs in restaurants. Where are they getting their produce from, right? That may not be as far as you might think as a developer in terms of, okay, we're positioning this beautiful restaurant. It's on par with what we've built. We have this chef. They said yes. They're our headliner. That chef needs to be then
that food. Many cases. I mean, I think chefs really care. Chefs are a big part of this. I don't want to put them down at all, but if they don't have a choice, they have to get the best ingredients. And they're literally, farm one we talked about, there's these microgreens, these edible flowers.
Yeah.
They were growing them locally because chefs were flying them in on refrigerated planes. I mean, that's
Right.
really where it comes from. So you could go have this beautiful, amazing meal, but the carbon footprint of it, the waste of it,
Oh, it's
just to
insane.
me makes it less appealing, And I think the chefs don't want that. They want to change that. And I think that there is so much collaboration possible when you're planning and doing this placemaking to say food is part of this place.
I think it's crazy that we haven't been doing that. So welcome to 2024.
Yeah.
Everybody meet Henry. Agritecture, let's go. I love it.
Yeah,
What a
let's
good
do it.
episode, Henry. I'm so excited to publish this. And
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure. I'm glad you're doing this.
me too. It's so much fun. All right, we will make sure everybody gets a chance to connect with you guys. Check out the description for all the places you can connect with Henry, and also the Built World episode that he was featured in.
Yeah.
He gives a lot of really interesting information. Of course, a few years ago was a very particular time in our history, very, very interesting stuff. So check it out. And thank you so much, Henry. Enjoy
Thanks for
Margaret
having me,
Spain.
Danielle. Really appreciate
We'll
it.
talk to you again soon.